This is a podcast about new crops. You're going to love it. Join us on The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin.
I realized I was kind of a data point of one in the US. I didn't know anybody else growing these apples commercially, organically in our Midwest conditions. So it's been a lot of trial and error, and it's trial and error to this very day. So at least, as my husband has said, well, if we can't sell it all, we can just drink it.
Welcome to another episode of The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin. My name is Stefan Mirsky, and I'm a commercialization outreach specialist with UW-Madison. Today's episode is all about cider apples and making hard cider, and I'm really excited to talk about this subject. This is our first ever Cutting Edge episode about cider apples, and we've got two panelists joining us today with a lot of expertise in how to make hard cider. So joining us is Dan Bussey, who is an apple historian, orchard manager, cider maker, and author of a 7-volume series all about the history of apple varieties in America and Canada. And our other panelist joining us today is Deirdre Birmingham from the Cider Farm in Mineral Point, Wisconsin, which is about 10 minutes west of Madison. So I'm just going to have the two of them introduce themselves and give a little background on their business and experience with cider making. So Dan, do you want to go first?
Sure. Anyways, I'm Dan Bussey. I've been a long time apple grower. I started growing heirloom apples since the late 70s, and I really never looked back. That's what I really enjoyed growing and reading about and writing about. And I spent many years as a cider maker here in Edgerton. Mostly I was making the raw product, unfermented product that I was selling then to like the Wine and Hop Shop in Monroe Street and Willie Street Co-op and whatever came by my door that wanted a good mix of cider that I was making. And so it was a lot of fun. I did that for 24 years. Currently now, and then I was, of course, then the orchard manager at the Seed Savers Exchange for 6 years, and built up the collection there before I left. And now I'm retired, but not retired. I'm the orchard manager for the Silverwood County Park Heirloom Orchard Project, which is in southeast part of Dane County, where we're planting a community orchard of about 1,200 trees, hopefully about 600 varieties of apples that will be available for anyone to come down and sample and take, and where we'll have all the extra apples when they're producing available for cider makers to make hopefully some very interesting cider.
Cool. That's exciting. That's really cool. Deirdre, do you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Yes, and my background connects to Dan in ways. So back in late 2002, my husband and I had the chance to finally buy a piece of land so that we could do our farm-based business together. And we got this naturally pretty piece of land, not knowing what we were going to do, just that we'd farm organically and have some kind of nice, high quality finished product. And in our thinking process, we landed on doing apples for cider. And when I say cider, I mean the fermented kind, the pre-prohibition cider here in America, and what the rest of the world calls cider. So we learned that cider is fermented like a wine. It's not brewed. And so we thought, if we're going to ferment the juice of apples, well, you don't make it, and you ferment it similar to a wine, you don't make a great wine out of just any old grape. So we thought, what kind of apples? And we learned about English and French cider apples, that they, in particular, the English and French, developed such apples. And some of the apples even have tannins. And tannins in a wine grape can give complexity, character, mouthfeel, give it some depth. So we thought, great, these are the kind of apples we want to grow. And then we quickly found out they weren't commercially sold in the US. So then this is where Dan enters, because he was teaching a class on grafting through UW Extension. And we heard about that class, signed up right away for it, hung out with Dan after the class, and turns out he has some of these very cider varieties in his own small orchard. So that started, the grafting just went from there. So Dan and I would order rootstocks together. Dan helped me hone my skills. He grafted some trees for me alongside my grafting. And so he plays a key role in the foundation of the Cider Farm and our brand. Our brand, our ciders and apple brandies are all based on this farm. And we focus on those tannic apple varieties since we can't really get those anyplace else. I guess nobody else is crazy enough to try to grow them because they are challenging. And then doing them organically adds another layer of complexity, let's say, or challenge to it. But we're very glad we went this route. It's certainly not the route for everyone, and it's a very uncommon route. It was 10 years before we even had a product in the marketplace. First, you have to get good at grafting, and then I realized I was kind of a data point of one in the US. I didn't know anybody else growing these apples commercially, organically in our Midwest conditions. So it's been a lot of trial and error, and it's trial and error to this very day. So, yeah, so it's quite a journey, but at least as my husband has said, well, if we can't sell it all, we can just drink it. But it's great finding people that have a lot of interest in sort of real ciders, and in these ones that feature the apple. That's what we're about. So you've got two people here on this podcast who are really about the apple, and there's a lot of creativity in the American cider market, and I guess we find ourselves not being as creative by adding a lot of things to our ciders. We try to make it kind of feature what cider more historically has been, as well as what these great apples can add to it.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit more about the apples that you use and the varieties? So Dan, I know this is your area of expertise as an apple historian. Can you just talk a little bit about those English and French varieties and what makes them so great for cider?
Well, most of the European cider varieties are a species called Malus sylvestris. That's the European wild crab. And they tend to have more flavors that are, the apples tend to be probably a little bit smaller, not always, but smaller. And that changes the skin to pulp ratio, so it can sort of concentrate the tannin aspect. So what they're looking for, of course, are the bittersweet flavored apples, the bitter sharp flavored apples. I think the most popular variety in the States is probably the bittersweet varieties. That tends to be the kind that we're looking for. A lot of sweetness, some aroma, hopefully with the apple if it has it, and then having that tannin structure that just gives you that mouthfeel and a quality to the cider that the deserted apples just don't have. So it's been really fun. I've grown a lot of different kinds. I think one of the first ones that was notable for cider in this country was the Virginia White that came out in the late 1600s. And then I think it was followed very quickly by the Hughes Virginia Crab, which is still a variety that's available today. A lot of people use it as a cider type. I think it does better perhaps maybe in eastern and southern states, but it does grow in Wisconsin and Iowa. It does pretty well. So there's a lot of different kinds out there, which is really fun. That's the thing, as Deirdre mentions, is having so many to choose from. You will find the subtleties as where they grow in your area, what ones do well and what ones don't.
And yeah, so you talked a little bit about the different qualities of those European cider apples, like the tannins and the sweetness and the bitterness. But what separates those cider varieties from just kind of your everyday dessert apple that you'd find in a supermarket?
Well, mostly a lot of them aren't particularly tasty. That's a lot of it.
Don't
So
want to
you,
eat.
yeah, you sort of think that's sort of counterintuitive. If you'd like to eat it, you ought to make great cider out of it. That doesn't always work. A lot of these are what we call spitters. They're so puckery when you eat them that just like, you just shake your head about that. But when you analyze the structure of the apple and you check the juice, sometimes you find that these apples that are so bitter have an incredible amount of sugar in them. And it's really fun to sort of play with that, because it gives you then the sugar you need for the alcohol or production, and it just gives that flavor and mouthfeel, which is great. But I find out that there's differences in this country about what kind of ciders that people like. In New England, they tend to like more of an acidic cider, so you use what they would call a bitter sharp apple. And then in the Midwest and most other places, I think the bitter sweets are the kinds that I think most people like. I was at Apple Camp in Maine just a couple of weeks ago, and it's sort of like a mini cider con, which is the big cider convention most years. And there was a lot of commercial cider makers that were there, and we talked about the different styles of apples. And that's what tends to be popular in the Northeast, are the ones that have a little sharper flavor, a little bit more acid than the ones that are here. But that's the fun of it. And I think the biggest thing that everybody's looking for now are foraged apples. They call it scrumping, looking for those wild apples that are growing in hillsides and scattered places around that they think will make the next new great cider variety. Because a lot of the European cider apples that we get are a little touchy to grow, as Deirdre well knows. They tend to ripen sometimes a little bit too early. They don't get a chance to really develop their sugars, I think, as they should. They're very subject to fire blight, and that is always a problem when you're a grower, but having trees that stay alive, that's kind of important. So there's a lot of problems that I've come to find with the European cider varieties. I will never stop growing them, but I realize that they have their limitations. So it's really a fun thing right now that more people are foraging wild apples for cider production, that they've come across that have these really great characteristics. When you bite them, they're just kind of nasty to eat, but there's a lot of really good sugars that are in there, and they do end up making some pretty decent ciders.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think we're going to have to dedicate a whole nother episode to apple production for cider making specifically. But Deirdre, if you could just touch on like how do you manage your orchard with these varieties that are not adapted to our region?
Well, some are better adapted than others. So in our first block of trees, maybe about 800, 1,000 trees, maybe I think I had about 10, a good 10, maybe 11 varieties in there. And now I'm reducing that down to 4 or 5. I mean, some of them just deselected themselves because they were so sensitive to this lethal disease that Dan mentioned, called fire blight. So, and it's highly contagious, a bacterium, and so it's a lot of these cider varieties are susceptible to it, and some greatly so. So that one French variety called Médaille d'Or, which stands for gold medal. Yep, Dan's laughing. He lost it too. That one didn't medal here at all. So now we're trying one called Mété, and that is one that's actually grown in the Calvados region of France for the Calvados apple brandy, and so it's great for us since we also do apple brandy. But yeah, spring is definitely a touchy time for me. I'm on edge because not just of frost, but because of that fire blight being, I mean, that's a key time for it to enter the blossoms is at that time. So that's quite a challenge, keeping the trees protected from heat, from rain when we have warm weather. We also we find that the cider varieties are more prone to rot. We do grow 2 table apples for blending with all these tannic apples, and one in particular for its acid, since the bitter sweets are very low on acid. And those, don't seem to have much problem with rot at all, but the cider varieties definitely can have such issues, and that's a real tough one to deal with also. We don't pump nitrogen into the trees. When people are getting orchards established, they're really trying to get them to grow tall fast, and we don't do that because that makes them more susceptible to fire blight. So yeah, you have to, there's always kind of trade-offs in whatever you do. So but we don't get a lot of quantity from them, but we do say we get quality. And I have figured out, one of my favorite ones to grow, I just saw early on that, hey, I like the way that tree grows, is Dabinet. And that's a nice English bittersweet. It can be annual. Ours, with the wacky weather we've had, has gotten to be a bit biennial, meaning every other year. This is a big year for it after getting hit by 3 freezes last year. So yeah, so right now we're struggling with our biggest crop ever, but it's a great struggle to have.
Yeah.
moment we've been waiting for.
Yeah.
So
Well,
and I run test rows of apples. The other thing too, and Dan mentioned wild apples. We've always encouraged friends to go after all these wild apples, and we would have a community apple pressing here and get those spitters and get this melange, this great mix of apples, no matter what size, what they look like, what color, just throw them all in the hopper, and it just makes great juice. There's more to it than just sweetness. There's some complexity to it. Really nice viscous in the mouth. But it's certainly when they go home and ferment it, it yields some nice cider. And Dan brought to us a wild apple tree found in Minnesota called Crone Bush, where the person who found it knew Dan was the go-to guy, because he said it had a lot of tannin and a lot of sugar, high bricks.
Yep.
So we've got that going now, and we're getting a crop off of that this year. So we're looking forward to seeing how it works out.
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, so with all these different apple varieties and different qualities that they impart into the cider, can you just talk a little bit about the process of making the cider, and how do you choose which varieties to use, and do you blend them, or you just do single variety ciders? Can you just like walk through the process of how you make cider? Just kind of a brief summary of how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, I say that the cider making, begins when we're apple pressing, because I will press when I have varieties that ripen at a similar time, and they're going to go in the bottle together. Well, then I like to press them together. So so the commingling of those of what those juices have to offer is already starting right from the apple pressing. We also, when our fermenter is available, we'll try to bring fresh juice right over to the fermentation tanks. We also make apple brandy, or have apple brandy made. So we work with a distillery, and we take some of our juice right to the distillery, and we do more of a Calvados style, meaning that we're also using a lot of bitter tannic apples in the mix. So some of these go for distillation. We like a nice mix. And then I look at like my classic dry cider, one brand we have in the market that has 5 different tannic apple varieties in it, with a tart apple base, produced by Liberty, a Cornell variety. And so I have to, make sure I've got totes that have those, one might have 3 different tannic varieties that ripen at a similar time. Another one might have another 2. We also do a rosé cider. So we're pressing our first red flushed apples today. And that's just always so fun to see this, gosh, this deep red or this rosy colored juice just coming out of the press. So that gets sectioned off and goes to our rosé cider. We have a later variety called Redfield that we'll be pressing later in the fall, and we'll reserve that so that we can blend all those together for a rosé cider to be released later this year or in the spring. I've got another cider called Tremlets, and that's just two apple varieties. We grow up Priscilla, which is an American apple developed by Purdue Rutgers in Illinois to be disease resistant. But I found that I just had a hunch when we first started doing the blends that and the Geneva Tremlets bitter would be complementary to each other. And I had kind of the right ratios. The tannin and the Geneva Tremlets bitter is quite strong and packs a punch. So we blended those two, and found it was quite appealing to those who knew cider, and so we continue to make that blend today. And now we've had to ramp up our grafting. I didn't really like to do much with the Geneva Tremlets before because it's just every other year. The tree is 1 year on and 1 year off. So, but I thought, well, geez, it does make a good cider, so I guess I'll just have to put up with that. But those two ripen at a similar time. So we'll be pressing those in about 10 days. But yeah, so the pressing starts there on the farm, and then it continues when we go to do, we freeze juice also, and then we can pull specific totes with according to the juice content for doing the blends we want. We have another cider called Dabinette. So that's the star tannin in that blend, and that's when we came up with this year. So and we give Dabinette a little bit of our Porter's Perfection and Chisel Jersey apples just to round out some of the tannins with the Liberty apple. So
So just curious, like how scientific of a process is this? I mean, Dan, when you make cider, like are you just kind of tasting the fresh juice and kind of seeing where to go from there in terms of blending, or are you actually out there with like scientific instruments measuring these different qualities?
I used to do a little bit more testing, but I think I have a refractometer, so I can tell the dissolved sugar. Refractometer is a little device that you put a couple of drops of cider on a glass, and you close the lid, and you look through it, a sight glass, and it will tell you how many degrees Brix, which is the amount of dissolved sugar that's in your juice, and it does vary every year. This year being a little bit of a wet year, I've noticed the Brix level is a little bit lower on a lot of varieties. So I wouldn't call this necessarily a great vintage year, but it's a great quantity year. So we're going to be able to get lots of really good quality juice from some of these varieties. Let's see where I was going to go with this, but I think I've come to realize that I trust my taste buds more than anything else. I can analyze things. I could send it off to be tested or do it myself. But I just find that, I make what I like. That's probably the nice thing about being an amateur cider maker, and I don't do this professionally, is I know what I like to put together in a mix. I tend to mix probably as many different kinds of apples as I can, because what one lacks, another one picks up. And as Deirdre knows, it's really getting that right ratio, that right mix that give you that quality that is trying to be consistent from year to year to year. And I think that's the fun of being a amateur cider maker like myself, because it's going to be very different, but you can tweak your batches based on what you tasted. You can press some of these varieties separately and then see what that's like, and test another variety, and then you can do some mixing from that point on. It's kind of fun. I don't do single varietals as a rule, because I think they tend to get a little bit one-dimensional. Some varieties are okay at that, but there's a lot that I think just kind of leave you hanging a little bit. I happen to have a cider that was made from the Harrison apple. It was a cidery out in Colorado that I got some from, and that makes a wonderful cider by itself. And that's one of the rarities I think I've ever had that was really good just by itself. However they processed it, it was really good. But my feeling has always been try to mix as many different kinds, many different types of flavors, not like the same kind all the time, but some ones that are sort of moderately like builders, they're your foundation of your cider, but then you add these ones that have some pretty intense flavors, just enough to give it that great mouthfeel and great quality to it. And it's really fun to put some of that away. And then I'll age it. Sometimes I'll age it in oak, and those little different ways of treating it. I don't like to add different flavors to it. It's not my thing, but I know a lot of people do. You have to make a cider if you're doing it commercially for the people that are going to be your customers. You have to make things that maybe you might like to be a little stronger, but you have to make cider a product that I think appeals to as many people as possible. But it's fun to play around with some of these exceptionally interesting varieties, let's put it that way, that just add a lot of character and see where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I assume, Deirdre, there's year to year, you're not going to be making the same cider. It's going to be very different. And so once you have the fresh pressed juice, what's the process from there?
Sure.
Either one.
I could start because Deirdre is certainly more professional than I am, but I'll tell you what an amateur does is to get your juice. I don't use wild yeast typically. I like to just sort of make sure my cider is going to turn out. So I buy just dry packets of yeast, of cider type yeast, but I will use like British ale yeast. I will use a Pasteur champagne yeast. I know there's a lot more cider type yeast that are out there that are great, and they all do make a subtle difference in the way your juice turns out. So I'm kind of sticking them out. I will use the same thing over and over and over again. I don't experiment a lot because I like what I get out of it. But would be better if I probably branched out and tried more of some of these varieties. So you basically have your juice. You will then add, you use a carboy, like a 5-gallon carboy if you're doing a small quantity. That's the easy way to manage it and move it around. You will have a packet of yeast, which will handle about 5 gallons worth. You follow the directions and you put in a little bit of warm water to get it started. You pitch it, which is how you add it to your cider. But you do need to check your cider to see how much sugar is in it, because you're looking for about 6% alcohol. That gives it shelf life. You need to have at least 5 to 6%, I think, to be able to have it so it lasts for a while and doesn't turn bad on you. So you can add sugar to it, which is probably the best product because it gives it a cidery kind of a flavor. People will use honey, which is great. That it's a different complexity, but that's fun as well. You can use brown sugars, but I just use a plain cane sugar and sometimes beet sugar, and that works to get so I have at least 6%. I'll make mine typically a little stronger, but not a whole lot more than that, because when I'm giving cider to my guests, I don't want to inebriate them immediately. It's nice to play with them for a little while. So you put in a fermentation lock because you need to keep the air out of your cider mix because you don't want to make vinegar. And the fermentation lock basically has a little bit of water in a little deep part of the unit, and so bubbles can get past it, but air can't get back. So you let it bubble away. It gets really frothy when it first gets going. It's quite wild. I've got stories I can tell you about that, but that's for another day. But let it froth for a while. Keep it in a place where you could sometimes wash off the container, because sometimes foam comes out of the fermentation lock. So you need to have a spare or be able to clean it out. There's different ways of doing it, but this is the typical. And you let it basically bubble until it pretty much stops. It takes about 8 weeks or so. Good fermentation temperature is around 68 degrees. You don't want to work it too fast. You don't want to do it too slow, but 68 degrees has generally been sort of a modicum of the correct temperature. And then when it gets down there, you see the activity is a lot less. And that's a point where then you would like to rack your cider into another clean container. basically you've got all that spent yeast down at the bottom of your container and you want to clarify it. So by being able to siphon all the material above that layer of basically dead yeast cells onto a new clean container, then you can keep doing that until basically you can have a very clear product without much haze in it. And at that point, you will then mix up about a half a cup of sugar in a pint of water, boil it on the stove to sanitize it, stir it together. And then when it cools down a little bit, you can put that back into your cider that's in the container and then bottle it, because that's your priming sugar for a nice sparkling cider. Each gallon or each 5 gallons of cider will make about 52 12-ounce bottles of beer, or use a beer bottle for that. You can use other containers, but you need to have something that can handle pressure. So old champagne bottles are wonderful for it. Don't use old wine bottles because they can't pressurize those at all. And then you can cap them and put them away for a while, let it age a little bit. Sometimes I've got a friend that puts charred oak chips in his, which is kind of interesting. You're pouring cider and this stick comes out, but it gives your cider that nice sort of tannin structure, vanilla tones from the oak. You can play around with it. You can age your cider in oak containers. There's lots of fun little things you can do, but that's the basics of making cider. It is so simple, it's not funny.
Yeah, that's what I love about cider too. It's so easy. Does that sound about how you do things, Deirdre, just on a larger scale?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, Dan mentioned checking your Brix level, or your you want to know kind of what sort of sugar you're starting with. So you can get a thing called a hygrometer to help you measure that, and that can also help you ascertain, if not just by taste, but how dry it is. Of course, we do use packaged yeast for our blend. We use an organic one. And then we have fermentation tanks, and they have temperature controls on them. So, and then since we can't really prime with sugar to get the carbonation, we have a carbonating tank. For some reason, they're called bright tanks. So that's the last stage before packaging, that it goes into that carbonation tank.
Cool. So probably a lot of our listeners are familiar with kind of the mainstream brands of cider, like Angry Orchard. How do the ciders that you guys make, how are they different?
They have flavor.
Well, they have flavor from the apples, whereas,
Yes.
I mean, like for example, we do a rosé cider and we use actual red fleshed apples. We will add some other fruit juices to give some more color and to balance acidity, but we're not using, I mean, there are some interesting things. I think it's like sweet potato peels and some other things to kind of make it rosé. And we're expanding our rosé apple collection. Some of those varieties that just haven't worked out well, and I'll now top working them to some red fleshed apples, since some of them are doing quite well. And there is a tannic one that grows quite well called Redfield. So so I think we're featuring the apple. I mean, we do an oak aged cider like Dan was talking about. We can sometimes have gone off onto the other side, you might say, just for some of those commercial purposes, but we're not adding like habanero chilies or blood orange juice, or, I mean, it was distressing to me when I first saw this happening some years ago in the Cider Craft magazine about, people making those kinds of things. And I just thought, where is the apple in all of that? But I think that a lot of that's because, and people don't really know this very much, because even craft cider makers, besides some large brands, will buy just apple juice concentrate. I mean, one at the big cider conventions said in a seminar that he just uses whatever's cheapest on the global market. And so, I mean, China's the largest producer of that. So it could very well be from there. But it's, I mean, what is juice concentrate? Well, it's boiled down apple juice. So you are losing aromas and you're losing some of the flavors, or you're changing some of them. So I think maybe if people are using that as their base, they have to do something, because there may not be that much there. And so sometimes I think, well, then you could just almost be using anything if you're just going to be making it taste like something else, or adding an entirely different different set of flavor profiles. So to to give it something. But that's, I mean, I think in the American market there's just a lot of creativity, and so that I think is to be noted. But it's just, our path is not that one. And there's plenty of sweet cider in the marketplace, and so we wanted to be drier, because I don't want to. I mean, I tell people I'm not going to go to the trouble of growing these varieties organically with these lovely tannins in them and then just cover them up with sugar. I mean, you can do some back sweetening to balance, especially acidity. And we one year just had, it turned out with a very cool fall and some very low pHs. And so in our tremblet cider, the only thing we could do to balance that acidity was to do a little more back sweetening. But we got these lovely notes of caramel apple. And it sold very well. But I had to say, hey, that's a 1 year phenomenon. We don't know how often that would happen again. So, being an agricultural product, you can get that year to year variation, especially when you are featuring the apples in the cider.
Sometimes when you have like a really acidic cider, you can do a malolactic fermentation. It's an extra product you can put in there, and it sort of will buffer that acidity down, and it'll actually give your cider some Chardonnay notes, and it'll have sort of a buttery constitution like Chardonnays do. So there's some fun things you can do that are very simple and don't take much. But I think Deirdre is exactly on point, where it's about the apples. There are a lot of people that got into the cider business because they wanted to make cider. They didn't grow the fruit, but they knew how the process worked. So they were just buying tanker loads of dessert apple cider and putting it out and calling it their wonderful apple cider. And frankly, it doesn't work for me. It just doesn't. I have a friend of mine who calls that a middle C cider on the piano scale. It's kind of right in the middle. It appeals to about anybody, but it's not exceptional one way or the other. But it's drinkable. I mean, that's the lovely thing about it. It's kind of like a lawnmower cider of beer. It's just one of those things. It's a really good thirst quencher, but it's nothing that I would go out of my way for. So a true artisanal cider maker like Deirdre, utilizes really good apples to make the product that she makes, and that's why to me it's this fabulous cider. Do a lot of wonderful things. So other varieties, I know we dance around a little bit, but I like to use russet apples whenever possible, because they have a really great sugar acid balance. They aren't necessarily tannic. So you may need to add a tannic variety, but I think they typically have better aromas and a real rich, deep flavor, which is wonderful for making hard cider from. So I'm a big fan of using russet apples whenever I can, but blend it with some of the ones that have that bitter, sharp flavor, bittersweet flavor for that mouthfeel, and it really makes a pretty neat product. So the fun of it is experimenting with whatever you have at hand, but realize that you want to make a cider that I think is significant, and it's going to be different from year to year, but that's what makes it fun, because who knows what it's going to be like next year. Subtle, it may be, but the same friend of mine also likes to blend horseradish into his cider. He will dice up horseradish roots. Now I'll tell you, that is something to be appreciated. But it is pretty good. It pairs really well. You have to think about this, how it works with food. This
Mhm.
pairs with bratwurst really well, and pizza, and stronger flavored things. So you can have a lot of fun with this, just using ingredients that you have around. Some people use aronia berries, which I don't particularly care for, but it adds a lot of color if you don't have red fleshed apples. But it's fun to, like I said, that's the fun of being an amateur. You can make small batches of bad things and not waste a lot of material. But
Yeah.
sometimes it turns out pretty well.
Yeah, speaking of aronia, I mean, that is a highly tannic fruit. So
Yeah.
you could get color and tannin from that. And we do have a friend who's won many amateur awards for his aronia bloomer dropper sizer. So it is quite high octane, but I think that one does the best of his different sizers because of that aronia.
Mm.
And although we've talked a lot about tannic apple varieties, we do have two table apple varieties we grow. But then our plan from the start was, well, we focus on the tannic, then to also collaborate with other organic growers. And so there's been two that in some years we have purchased just like a blend of table apple juice from them. And they also make their own brand of cider. So they know what we're after. But yeah, so you can blend in some of those dessert apples to get the aromas, the acid in particular. Since a lot of these, as Dan was mentioning, in the Midwest, bittersweet means the apple is high in tannin but low in acid. So
Yeah.
the blend is good.
I had a chance to try a cider from New York State that was a smoked cider. Now that's different. It's like sort of drinking a campfire. It's unique. I have to admit, I
Wow.
have no idea how they make it, but that's something that's kind of running the gambit around some of the cideries now, is these variations of how you make cider. But the smoked cider is something totally new to me. I have no idea how they do it, but oh well.
Huh.
Lots of different choices out there.
Yeah. So Deirdre, just in general, do you not add anything to your cider? Like, aside from the apples, you're not adding any other flavorings or fruits or anything. It's just pure.
No, there are two that we do that with, and we might sulfite at the start, and so we have one that's called cider, which by definition means you fermented honey with the apple juice, and the result is cider. And and it gets to a higher alcohol, it's 9%. So it is technically an apple honey wine according to the federal government. And we have to label it as such, and we get to put wine tax on it. But we do have one called Equinox, where we add a subtle hops called Equinox. And this was requested. We private label ciders for some friends, and they requested that. And we thought, oh, we didn't know how hops would actually work. We'd only had kind of some bad hopped ciders at the time, but they were friends, and we wanted to be open-minded, so we sampled out a bunch of hops. And when we got to one called Equinox, it was like a pause around the table, and somebody goes, I'm getting a little notes of like a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc on this. And our tagline was cider refreshment with wine complexity. So we thought, hey, I think we can do this. So we don't emphasize that there's a subtle hops in there, but it gives it green grassy citrus notes characteristic of a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And then we have another one that's quite different, where my husband was reading a book on Belgian farmhouse ales and thought, wonder if we could do a cider that incorporates some of these flavors. And so we've come out with that. And so there are quite a few adjuncts in it, like several hops, bitter orange peel, seed of paradise, star anise, bergamot. But it's quite popular. So that's like a limited release cider for us. So that was kind of our step away from what we usually do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talked a little bit about the different preferences in flavor. Like, from the northeastern part of the US and the Midwest. Have there been tastings to discern like what kind of cider people prefer in this area? And then have you, made cider to match those preferences or?
No, I just make what I like. Just
Yeah.
I'm stuck in like I like what I make. I think it's pretty decent cider, but it is fun to taste other people's experiments. I had a toasted coconut rum cider, which I'll tell you, I wasn't sure if it was a little thicker, it might be a pie or it was cider, but that's not a flavor I would have more than one, but it was unique. But that's the fun of it. And a lot of people, of course, are trying the single varietals. Arkansas Black was a popular one people were trying. And in that case, the quality or the different yeasts that they used made altogether all the difference in the world about how it tasted in the long run. So I think apples are a lot of the component part that really stands out. But boy, I'll tell you, sometimes it's the yeast that how it acts upon that apple makes quite a bit of difference too. So be flexible about what you're trying and try a couple of different ways and see what comes out. It's not like you have to search for that perfect yeast or whatever, but learn to make a good apple cider by itself, and that should stand alone. But it's fun to play around with it, come up with a couple of different things, because taste is so subjective. What I like is not going to necessarily be what someone else likes. There's a flavor quality called barnyard funk that sounds really terrible, but that is actually my favorite cider style because it has these sort of earthy tones to it. And there's some Somerset ciders that I've had from England that have that barnyard funk quality to it. And I really like those. Those tend to be what really makes me happy. But that's the fun of it is understanding yourself, what you like, and hopefully you find enough other people that like what you make, and you can sell it. But that's the joy of it, is experimenting.
Yeah, and I think Dan was commenting about the Northeast and the Midwest because he gets to travel a lot. He's a sought out person. So as he's been able to travel, move around, he's picked
Vagabond.
up. Yeah, he's picked up on these nuances. So so that was interesting to hear that.
Yeah. Deirdre, can you talk a little bit about the apple brandy that you make?
Yeah, so it's we put together the juice and then we take it to the distillery and then they start fermentation that day. So it's we press one day and then the next morning we truck it over to the distillery and they pitch it with yeast, just like you do to make cider, because you first got to convert the juice to cider, and then it goes for distillation. Once it's stabilized, there's not a rush to get it. Once it's stabilizes as cider, then there's not a rush. You can kind of get in the queue and wait for the distillation tanks to be to be open. But we've done kind of two things. We worked with a distiller who does like a double distillation. So first they do a stripping run where you're just heating you're heating the cider and you're getting the alcohol to volatilize off. And so they separate out what they call the heads. It's the first part to volatilize off. It has a lot of acetone in it. And it literally smells like nail polish remover. So that's what craft distillation does. It moves that out. Big, huge, giant distilleries just mix it all together. And that's where people might get a headache from drinking too much cheap liquor. And so then they go for the heart. And that's what they really capture. And then the tails are also discarded because those have some characteristics that aren't as tasty. So and when it's double distilled, first they'll just do a stripping run to just get all the alcohol out, and then they fractionate it into those three components. The other kind of some of the other distillation we've been experimenting with at a different distillery is to use more of a French still, an alembic still, where it's all there isn't a two-step process. They just monitor for the heads and the tails as it's coming off the still. And then we barrel age it. So we have a 2-year aged and we have a 5-year aged. And we started out using charred oak bourbon barrels with some wild apple wood from the farm. And then one year when there was a barrel shortage, we thought, well, heck, the French use their barrels for generations. So let's just reuse our barrel. And we aged it an extra year I mean, at that point it was 3 years, and we love the result. So now we continue to reuse all of our barrels, but we've also expanded production. So we continue to bring in barrels, and we've been experimenting also now with some toasted oak wine barrels. So first use, there was no like bourbon in them before. So we're looking to see how that affects it, but you got to wait at least 2 years, if not 5.
That's a long time to wait.
Yeah, so these experiments, you gotta have some patience.
Yeah.
And so far we've been fortunate. We've just had a lot of good batches, but the apple varieties and the year, what was the growing conditions of that year can make a real difference. We've found too, because we had our first release, and then our second release came out from a batch that was from the summer in March, freezes in April, late April, the hottest July on record, and the worst drought in 25 years. That juice was so thick and aromatic. The distillery said they've never smelled anything like it. The aromas just permeated the distillery. So,
Wow.
And that produced, because a lot of our very late blooming, we got mostly late blooming bittersweets that survived that year. So it made, at first I was alarmed that it was so different from the first batch, and the distiller said, "Your apples, remember?" And I smelled he had, right when it came off the still, he lifted the lid of the container for me, and I just thought, "Ooh, this is going to be a face full of alcohol," because it's like 140 proof. And it was like, wow, those are some nice aromatics. It wasn't just alcohol. So it really drove home the point that the apples used and the growing conditions do make a difference.
Yeah. Just to mention, Deirdre, I have a bottle from your first barrel still. I've been holding on to that for a long time.
And we've always liked that one. And we've had some others that we will compare to that and say, oh, well, yeah, this is
that was
like
a good one.
Or,
I bought a couple, so I made sure I kept one around just for whenever.
Great, thanks, Dan.
The longer you hold on to it, Dan, the harder it's going to be to crack it open.
I know, it's pretty tough, but it's just like having gold in my cupboard. That's what I love about it. It's just beautiful color. It's got such a nice aroma to it. The one that I did open and have, that disappeared a long time ago. But sometimes they call like the head and tails, they call it the four shots and feints. There's a lot of different terminology for it. Depends, I guess, where you learned it. But it is those sort of home stills are, I guess it's probably still technically illegal. I tried making it a couple of times, and it was a lot of fun. I think ethanol evaporates at about 163 degrees. So you have to get your product up to that temperature. And I guess the old fashioned way of doing it is when it drips out of the condenser is you have a little metal pan and you light it and you look for the color of the flame. If it's got a lot of yellow in it, you don't use it because it's got bad stuff in it. You wait till you got a nice blue flame, then your product is right. So you get rid of those early alcohols that evaporate a little bit differently. Then you leave it for the other ones that are good. And when it starts to come end the production and it starts turning color again on the flame, then you quit using it. You quit distilling at that point. So that's the unofficial amateur way of doing it.
Sounds a little subjective.
And scary.
Yeah.
You probably don't want to do that around a place with a lot of alcohol, a lot of distilled product.
No, it's somewhat dangerous. Yes.
Yeah.
But it was a unique product, I have to admit, when it was all said and done. Highly unrefined, but I guess that's how I feel about myself, I guess.
So, what have you noticed about the apple crop this year? I mean, Dan, you said it's because it's been a wet year, you think the sugars are low and
They're a little bit lower. There are lots of apples that I've not seen before. A friend of mine and I went uh, scrounging for apples on wild hillsides and around Eitzen, Minnesota, which is the southeast corner, and some other places. And we were finding apples on trees we'd never seen bear fruit before. And in this year, they actually were ripening sometimes several weeks earlier than usual. So it's kind of an unusual year, considering it seemed like it was such a long, protracted winter into spring. I didn't think we would have apples that were maturing sometimes 3 weeks earlier than usual, but that's what we're seeing. We tagged some of these trees before, and we had the date that we sampled it and the notes that we had on it. And this year it's really different. But there are a lot of apples and a lot of things that we found in this past couple of weeks that I think may have some potential for cider production. We found one. I'll have to share that with you, Deirdre. It's wicked. You thought the Kronbusch had a lot of tannins in it. I think this one is even crazier. It doesn't have the sugars though. That's the downside to it. We call it the black hole because if you cut a little piece of it and you sample it, it takes a while for you to pry your lip away from your teeth because it's just your mouth is shrunk so much. It's got so much tannin and astringency in it.
Wow.
But wow. I don't know if I was thinking I was going to we found some really good apples that we made some pies out of. And I thought, well, if I put a little piece of this apple in one corner, it'll sort of be like hiding the anchovy in a pizza, just to see if you run across that. But it's a seriously wicked apple, but we've never seen this tree bear before. And that's the fun of it because we're finding stuff that it's pretty unique. And if we get it back to more of a drier year, that the sugars are a little bit more concentrated, I think sometimes these flavors are going to be exceptional. And we're hoping that these will be good potential cider varieties, kind of like the Kronbusch, that have possibilities, I think. And they're hardy, they adapt well, they don't seem to have issues with fire blight. So that's what I think what I'm trying to look for is that next unique kind of apple that might be really popular. And I want it so people have access to it. It's not like I want to, command the market to sell it or anything like that. I think I like to open source things. If I find something that's really good, I want to share it with people because I think it's important. And that's the joy of this.
Yeah. Well, as we start to wrap this up, just curious, what are the both of you really excited about making this year? Is there any particular cider or flavor combination that you're excited about?
Go ahead, Deirdre. You start this one.
Oh, geez. Well, we've found that our Dabinette cider is doing very well. I mean, it's getting a lot of consumer appeal. So we got a great crop of Dabinette this year. So we'll certainly, which means we probably won't have a lot next year. That's the thing about we're going to kind of squirrel away some cider since with a big crop this year, it means you won't have necessarily that same size crop next year. But we're getting the most red flesh apples we've ever had. So I'm really looking forward to making even more rosé, getting that back on the shelf. Yeah, we're going to see how this Kronbusch does, and we'll put some of that into the apple brandy as well as into some of our cider blends, and we'll be checking the pHs and the bricks on things as we go. Typically at this start of the year, the bricks content, the sugar content's a little lower on these early ones, and it just seems to pick up as we with our later varieties. And we also leave apples on the tree for a long time. So we let them drop or wait till they are dropping and then shake them off the tree and harvest them off the ground. Because we want, for example, the Liberty apple, if I buy that from one of my organic table apple grower friends, it is quite tart, but ours is quite pleasant. It has so much more sugar and other flavors to it. And that's what we want out of every apple. So we really let them stay on the tree to just get everything that apple has to give us. And I think that also just gives you, a little bit more of the terroir. We're in the beautiful driftless region of Wisconsin, and we like to think that people are tasting some of that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan, anything that you're excited about trying or making this year?
I've got some new russet apples that are coming along finally, and the trees are starting to bear. So it'll be a small quantity, but I've got some Wyndham russet, some Lincolnville russet, a Dockham russet, and a few others that I can't remember the names offhand that I'm going to really be playing around with and see what the juice quality is, and try to mix up something that takes the best of both worlds of all these different kinds and see what I can do with that. But yeah, I've got some fun stuff coming along. The Silver Road Orchard is actually, most of the trees are still in the nursery, but some of them are already bearing fruit after 3 years. So there's some fun things to come along. No great quantity, but I'll be able to make some small batches and see what happens with that. So that'll be
Cool.
what I'm looking forward to.
Cool.
We also found we put out a lot of rootstocks where trees were missing. And I've been mostly using this Russian rootstock that its abbreviated name is Bud 9. And that little rootstock just likes to just jump up and grow and give you apples the second year in the ground. And they're
Wow.
red flushed. They're red flushed. So I'm like, hey, great, I'll take them. Until we top work you to something else, I'll take your little red apples and they'll go into our rosé cider.
Are you just gonna let those trees keep growing, or you're gonna actually use them as a rootstock eventually?
Yeah, no, we'll use them as a rootstock. I've got a couple that kind of, because they're actually more bushy. They kind of flop around. But I've got a couple that seem like they want to try to be like their neighboring trees and grow up big and tall. So, so we'll see if a few of them do that. But otherwise, we'll be top working them over to what else is in that row. Try to keep it consistent. What's in the row.
Cool. So, last question, I guess, is what would you tell somebody who's maybe looking to start a commercial cidery? Like what kind of advice, I guess, would you give them?
If you've had a chance to grow apples for a long time, a person, has a little bit of wherewithal about, I think, how apples work and what you can do with them. But I would suggest trying to mentor with an accomplished cider maker and learn the trade and what works, because it's a business. You have to consider it as a business. I love making cider, and I don't see a dime for it. That's not my point. Is that it's a joy, and I think you need to have the love to do it. But you have to also consider it as a business. So mentoring with a cidery, I think is probably a great way to learn, just to know what happens and where. There's a lot of cideries that aren't growers, but there is a lot that are both. And I think Deirdre is unique in that regard, that she grows the apples that she uses, which is wonderful. So I think that's the best way to learn, is learn the apples, and then you can learn the cidering and learn what you like to make and learn to drink. Do you want to do it as a business, or you want to just keep it at the small level and just do it for yourself and your friends? So once you can make that decision, you can go commercial. Then you have the background to do it.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think people already know that if you want to make this just for home use and friends and family, go for it. But yeah, commercially, I think Dan's got a great point. Now that there are other cideries, I think when we started, you had to go like to one of the coasts to find another cider.
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are places where you can get involved and learn all aspects of it, because alcohol is highly regulated. And sometimes you just don't even know what some of those laws and regulations and rules are out there. And until they present themselves to you in the mail or a phone call. So there's just a lot of kind of legal things. There's a lot of expenses you may not think about. So it'd be really good to get into a commercial operation and try to see all aspects of it and try to do all aspects of it, so that you have a much better idea of what approach you want to make. And then I think you have to figure out, do you want to deal with apples? Do you want to grow apples? Do you want to buy a source juice, and then what sort of juice? There is an orchard in New Hampshire Poverty Lane Orchard that does their own Farnham Hills ciders. And he was one of the first real commercial growers of these English cider apples in the US. So he's almost looked to as like a godfather of the cider industry. And he does very fine ciders and very, very quality oriented. And he also will sell these tannic apple varieties to other growers, or to other cider makers, I should say. So, if you want to try to go that route, you can also, but those kind of people are few and far between. And I, myself, of course, get hit up for our apples too. So, but
Do you sell your apples to other cider
we
producers?
we have not. It's kind of something I'm entertaining, at least thinking about this year. Previously, it's just like, no, we just don't have enough for what we're doing. But being a big crop year, I'm at least entertaining the thought. So,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
especially for some friends who are home cider makers and really would value the opportunity to work with these apples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. Well, any final thoughts or?
Well, we should all get together and drink some good ciders.
Yeah,
Yes.
that sounds great.
I want to try
Yes.
some of Dan's.
Yeah. Oh, it's the funniest thing is, I love cider because my father, when I was just a kid, brought home, we scrounged all the apples we could find here on the farm, and we had a local cider mill press it, and we brought home the juice, and my dad had a big gallon glass jar, and he left the cap loose on the counter, and it starts working and frothing and all that stuff, and that's when we drank it, is when it was starting to get really nice and fizzy and stuff. And that taste of that cider when I first made my own was exactly the same as what I had when I was a kid. So it's that taste memory that really hooked me on cider making, and I never looked back. It is just a joy. I love the cider. I think it's a great product. I think there's a great market for it in this country. I think people have turned around and really like what cider is. To me, you can make it still where there's no bubbles, or make it so it's fizzy and whatever you want. But it's such a nice product because it's just so little manipulated in comparison to a lot of things, that I think it's just really a wholesome, healthy, good product to have, and it's fun.
And Dan mentioned a still cider, and to do a still and dry cider, that's a real challenge.
Yeah.
Because wine and cider making can hide behind sugar. You can kind of ameliorate certain faults or whatever with sugar, and also just jacking up the carbonation. So when it's still and dry, it's kind of it's out there. It's almost like it's naked. I mean, it's just standing there on the quality of that cider. So
That's the true test of a cider maker, is how do they do a good dry still cider? Yeah, that's the apples have to talk.
Wow. Interesting. I could listen to this all day. But yeah, thank you two so much for joining this podcast, and really appreciate you making the time. It was really insightful, and I'm inspired to make more cider. So yeah, thank you, Deirdre, Dan. Thank you all for listening. This was another episode of The Cutting Edge, a podcast in search of new crops for Wisconsin, and our first episode on cider apples with Dan Bussey and Deirdre Birmingham. Thanks for joining us.
Brought to you by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension.